Oh, okay. Yes. All right. So first, a few words about the project that I mentioned, within which this conflict analysis tool was developed. So it's called Water Cooperation and Peace, Finnish Waterway, and it's funded by 3 ministries in Finland: the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Environment, and Ministry of Agriculture. And it's quite a long and sort of big project. We've been working now, this is the 3rd year of the project, but we have plans to continue, of course, depending a little bit also on the plans of the ministries. But in a nutshell, the idea of the project has been to strengthen this Finnish water diplomacy collaboration internationally. Then also to work on international transboundary agreements on water and their implementation. Then we're also trying to identify and sort of respond to water diplomacy training needs and competence building, both in Finland and internationally. And then we also aim to deepen cooperation between foreign policy and security mediation experts and the water sector, so kind of crossing the gaps between these 2 worlds. And actually one element in this has been the conflict analysis tool. So when we first set out, quite in the beginning of the project, what maybe we or what the water sector can give to the peace mediation and conflict prevention sector, and also to maybe see how we could make the water cooperation more understandable to policy people, while also contributing also something to water cooperation, water diplomacy. We thought that it would be very nice, or we actually thought that there might be a conflict analysis tool specifically for water already in existence, because we saw the sort of use of conflict analysis as kind of increasing understanding of so kind of creating a better awareness of the operating environment in which we work as water diplomacy promoters in a way, and then also better mapping the needs and possibilities for water diplomacy in a specific context. So also maybe identifying some actions that we could launch on as a part of water diplomacy work. And then, of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, we saw this the conflict analysis as a way of kind of improving the communication between the foreign security policy and conflict resolution, and then water and environmental sector, while then also improving foresight and conflict prevention from this kind of anticipatory model of conflict analysis that we are also trying to promote. Aspects that are often highlighted, especially in development cooperation, like conflict sensitivity and the do no harm principle, better into water diplomacy as well. But then we discovered that there is actually no existing, or at least we didn't find an existing tool for conflict analysis specifically for water. So that's why we wanted to develop our own one. But then at the same time, we didn't want to kind of reinvent the wheel. So we took some, especially in development cooperation. And we wanted to modify that towards the needs of water diplomacy. And the PACD model basically consists of this very simple kind of division between profile actors, conflict factors or causes, and dynamics. And I will give you a slightly better look at these just in a moment. But the way that we envisioned that this would be then used for water diplomacy is that the conflict analysis would be like an umbrella tool that would be quite possible to vary in different contexts and different situations, so that trying to something. but so that we can do different sort of kinds of conflict analysis in different situations. Then the idea, of course, was to focus attention on the role of water, especially, and then through that also maybe to identify some sources and resources for peace, not only the conflict inducing factors in the situation. So this is the model in a way, or the tool in all its glory. I will not go very deeply into the different sort of aspects, but here you can see that, as I mentioned, we use the profile, actors, conflict factors, and dynamics model, and then we've sort of under all of these sort of general titles, we've included more specific sort of aspects that we analyze, and in basically all of these, water is somehow integrated into the analysis. And by the way, this we provided or developed a guideline for using the conflict analysis for water diplomacy, which is available on the project website. I neglected to insert a link here, but you can find it quite easily. So now I will not explain all the different sort of aspects of the tool in much detail, but basically the idea was that we have the profile, which is basically an overview of the sort of socioeconomic and environmental context, mapping the governance institutions and also these socioeconomic factors like demographic developments and gender factors, but then also highlighting especially the water resources and water governance, and also kind of their future outlooks in a specific situation. So this is sort of building up this kind of background for the analysis. Then we have the actors, and here we look at them in a quite sort of inclusive way, in the sense that we are looking at different political or population groups that are somehow influenced by a potential conflict situation or who influence it themselves. So we especially track conflict parties and vulnerable groups, also taking into account non-state actors. And then we also look at like the most important external actors, and we try to focus also on the role of potential peacemakers in the situation. And in all of these, while tracing the actors, we especially look at how they are, what kind of interests they have related to water. Then we have the conflict factors, which are either structural causes or conflict drivers and triggers, more somehow immediately leading to a conflict. And we look at what kind of a role water has in these situations where somehow conflict is only triggered by water use, but rather we try to understand the sort of comprehensive whole of the situation. And again, here we look at factors that could work as peace enablers. And then finally, we come to the dynamics, which basically presents an overview of the interactions of all of the previous aspects that I was explaining. So we look at the sort of ongoing trends and future scenarios that might follow from them. Again, we especially focus on water-related interactions and these kinds of comprehensive dynamics like water, food, and energy interactions, and how water sort of has to be seen as one factor in the society and in the potential conflict situation. And from the dynamics, we then trace the potential risks and needs and opportunities for water diplomatic efforts. So then that leads to the results of the conflict analysis. And just as a kind of a reminder, as I mentioned in the beginning, we aim the tool to be very flexible, so it can be used in very different kinds of situations and so on. But there are some things that you always have to keep in mind, such as the very sort of basic but not always remembered issue that once you launch into a an analysis, you have to sort of size it to fit the resources that you have available, and then sometimes you can do a very sort of ad hoc kind of more narrow analysis, and that can be helpful. But then if you want to, especially when you're really planning to do some water diplomacy actions in a given region or country or situation, you have to be also more extensive, I would say, with the analysis. And then we highlight, for example, political sensitivities and kind of the understanding of the region in which you are operating, and even maybe the expectations that already carrying out this analysis might create in the region. And it also includes or kind of implies that we have to be very aware and consider our own biases and sort of interests and expectations in a certain situation. And then ideally, our idea is that the conflict analysis should not be this sort of one-off exercise that we just do and then forget about it, but rather that it would be sort of a more continuous approach that you then often or regularly update, and that it would also then help with some sort of foresight elements in a certain situation. But I'll actually stop there and move on to the discussion. And you are, of course, actually free to ask any questions that you have also about the conflict analysis model, but then also from our speakers. But we'll proceed so that we'll actually go first to Jenni, because she is the person who has been sort of applying this conflict analysis model into practice. So maybe you can tell us some of your experiences from that work.
Yes, thank you. So as Emma introduced, I'm Jenni Laasko from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. I work at the Center for Peace Mediation, and that sort of background of I think peace mediation has been a foreign policy priority for Finland, first mentioned in the government program of 2007, and then we have this sort of extensive water expertise. So we're part of the sort of, we're who coordinates the water diplomacy efforts on the foreign ministry side. And then I started at the center 2.5 years ago, and I work on the region of Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia and the Western Balkans. And then I heard about our sort of water diplomacy, something I hadn't really sort of, I had no sort of understanding of the field before. But I started looking and talking to our ambassadors about maybe possibilities of applying, doing some scoping. So we started in the South Caucasus doing sort of the scoping of possibilities of doing something, some water diplomacy effort, or if there indeed is a need for that in the autumn of 2022. And I think the model, the tool wasn't really like it was being prepared then, but it wasn't like ready. So so we started before we even had the tool available, which obviously made things a bit more tricky. So we started with missions and visits and talking to people already then, and then afterwards I started applying sort of what we had found out to the model, and immediately realized that we should definitely not have done it that way, but rather sort of because the foreign ministry sort of, we produce analysis all over the world all the time. So a lot of the questions that sort of came up, we could have maybe sort of, if we had put our own analysis into the model, we could have maybe directed our missions and sort of scoping to the region a bit better. But unfortunately, that's not how the timing worked for that. So I mean, that's I think because we produce all these analyses and different embassies and missions report from around the world, so we have this thought of ourselves that we really know what's happening everywhere, and we maybe don't need like a structured conflict analysis. But I think for this, at least for the water diplomacy, it was very useful, and especially when we did it sort of the wrong way around, that sort of highlighted how sort of how it actually could have improved our work on in this case. So the way we did it was that I would do the sort of more political conflict side of analysis, but then we also had an actual engineer with us working on the water side of the things, because that's not really sort of my expertise. So then he would, or we would write together, like he would maybe take responsibility on the technical analysis, and then we'd work on together on each section, which was immensely helpful, because I don't really, I don't even know how I could have survived all that. But so I think because we do all this sort of conflict related analysis all the time, I was wondering that maybe that would be something, like I could see the benefit of the tool, especially for someone who comes from sort of from more of the technical side. So like someone who doesn't consider these conflict factors in their work all the time. And especially my intention also was to sort of try to apply the tool in a way that we could actually see it being used at the ministry in the future as well, because honestly, I think the first paper Emma you wrote about, the first analysis was 100-something pages, and our preference is not to write anything above 3 pages. So I have to sort of find some kind of a middle ground there. So I think we got up to 20, like really trying to sort of find what were the important questions. And I still doubt many of my colleagues actually have read those 20 pages that we wrote. So sort of trying to even still distill and find a way to use it at the ministry, and not just for researchers and other practitioners, were some of my sort of personal goals for this. And I think that sort of remains still maybe a bit of a challenge for us to institutionalize it at the ministry. And I'm very happy to help. I think that's sort of ongoing work that we're going to do. Me helping and talking to colleagues who will start conflict analysis on different regions in the future. But maybe that's sort of a couple quick notes on our work, and then we can have a broader discussion on this.
I will actually change maybe the original order of speakers, so that I would ask Alyssa to be the next one.
Sure.
Share your experience from conflict analysis, and yeah, please go ahead.
Certainly, thank you, Emma. As Emma mentioned, I'm Japhet. I'm a doctoral candidate at the IH Delft Institute, where I look at multiscalar dynamics in my research. But then I also have the pleasure of working really at the subnational and local level as part of our Water, Peace and Security Partnership. And I wanted to reflect a bit on the conflict analysis tool. And one thing that I really like about the tool that you emphasize is really the importance of looking at different scales. And I think that that's something that's often quite easy to dismiss when we're looking at a water diplomacy discussion, because you want to do a quick analysis of what's the potential space for collaboration between countries. I wanted to just maybe briefly emphasize again why I think that multi-scalar dimension really brings a critical perspective into the kind of analysis that can be done, and really looking for spaces of potential cooperative opportunities. And for one of these reasons, and I think Natasha is going to get into a little bit with her comments, so I apologize to step on them a tiny bit. But I think that looking at these multi-scalar actors, so looking at potential academics, potential civil society organizations, subnational organizations, can give opportunities for potential solutions. You can bring in alternate actors as part of 1.5 diplomacy, but also track 2 diplomacy, where maybe having collaboration of academics in a transboundary basin can do some joint fact-finding or create a data set that might be a bit more trusted as parties enter into negotiations. But on top of that, it also can be an important aspect of conflict resolution. So what we've seen in some cases is there's been some tense topics that are difficult for different parties to agree on. Just bringing back a case from the 70s and 80s in Lake Constance, you saw a very tense discussions over motorboat regulations and emissions regulations. And while that couldn't be solved over 2 decades, where the solution was actually found was going to a different subnational organization that had a Swiss canton on board instead of the Swiss government. And in going to that kind of para-diplomacy level where you're bringing in subnational organizations, we're actually able to come to a comprehensive solution that in this case created regulations that were more restrictive than anywhere else in Europe. So really taking strong step forward on environmental protection in a cooperative manner. But on top of that, you can also create spaces to really create political windows of opportunity if you look at those subnational dynamics. Another example, just being in Lake Titicaca in the 90s or in the early 2000s, seeing domestic protests, especially by farmers, over different eutrophication in Lake Titicaca at the right time of a political campaign was really able to elevate water quality issues into the binational dialogue and into the binational commission on Lake Titicaca. I would say, while this is all wonderful and doing these subnational dynamics can really help to identify the spaces where conflict resolution can go, or conflict mitigation can go, it's also, as part of conflict analysis tool, a really beneficial place to understand potential spoilers. And that can also be in managing expectations in going into conflict resolution. So for instance, there's a lot of discussion about the Tigris and Euphrates basin. And if you look in particular on the Shatt al-Arab and in southern Iran, a lot of the impacts on water quality and water scarcity are to some extent triggered by the neighboring country of Iran and the tributaries that discharge into the Shatt al-Arab and a lack of water that's really coming in. But then digging deeper into that multi-scalar analysis of Iran, you can see that water scarcity taking place within Iran has also had its own localized protests and own subnational conflict dynamics that really constrain the ability of Iran to really create cooperative agreements and a little bit more sharing with Iraq. That being said, there are still MOUs being signed. It's not completely impeding any sort of collaborative process, but just understanding those constraints can also help to manage the expectations in the negotiations between Iraq and Iran. On top of that, you can also understand potential spoilers to where cooperative agreements exist, but might face problems. And I apologize, I'm pretty sure I'm going to say this name wrong, so my apologies in advance, but I think the Gabikovo-Imaros case is a prime example of this, where you had an agreement between the Slovak Republic and Hungary on the development of infrastructure, and then domestic protests in Hungary, as well as economic constraints, really led to Hungary wanting to pull out of the project. And this took what was a cooperative agreement with joint benefits to both parties, but potentially some environmental impacts, and really elevated to the International Joint Commission. So we saw a really cooperative opportunity there, translating into a nonviolent conflict that was handled in a very, institutional way, but still becoming a conflict situation. So with a little bit more analysis of these multi-scalar dynamics, you're able to see potential spoilers and build a bit more resilient conflict resolution processes. I will make a little caveat though. I do think once you really bring in these multi-scalar dynamics, the analysis gets quite complicated quite quickly, and certainly would be difficult for that 3-page analysis that you're looking for. And so I would maybe recommend finding ways to really visualize this in quite a simple way. And so one thing that we do in the Water Peace and Security Partnership, especially looking at the subnational and local dynamics, and I believe it was discussed also on Tuesday in the training, are these kind of causal loop diagrams or system dynamics. So it's a way to really visually understand those different convening factors that might lead to conflict. And might be something that is related to water, but not in a direct manner. So where it's really food security, that's triggering a potential anti-government protest. Or it's something related to the livelihoods, but water does feed into this either directly or through indirect routes. And I think that that can be beneficial when really looking at entry points.
Yes, great, thank you. Thanks for all the concrete examples. Excellent. We'll then continue with Natasha. I hope you're up for it and okay still. Nice to have you with us, Natasha, even though online.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel, and I sincerely apologize for not being able to join you in person as planned. Let me first start off by saying congratulations on the development of a much needed conflict analysis tool that doesn't only address, but more importantly, it acknowledges that water is political, and that should we want to use water or water diplomacy for purposes of peace building, we really need to look beyond the water sector and the technical water cooperation. Now, my organization, the Geneva Water Hub, has a mission through to 2035, and that is to advance the use of water for peace in humanitarian development and peace-building efforts. And we are anchored both at the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute, and at the interface of science and policy. And so while looking at this conflict analysis tool, I was doing so, with both the science and the policy, and it definitely resonates with our work at both levels, the science and policy level, but also the academic and the practitioner level. Previously, my colleagues, Dr. Mark Zaytoun and Dr. Laura Turley, have actually, shared their perspectives on the tool that you've developed from a research perspective, and they've obviously seen that there's an interest for the Geneva Water Hub to assist in both developing it further with you and also using versions of it. I would like to share my own perspective on the tool, both as a practitioner, but also as a former member of a water negotiation team. So as a practitioner, I lead the programs on water for peace in the West Asia and North Africa region. Obviously, a region that is unfortunately predominantly led by protracted conflicts, or as some of my partners in the region would call them, frozen conflicts. So my work is really a 1.5 track water for peace diplomacy, and I work a lot with technocrats in both a preventive mode, but rather preventing further deterioration, or in a conflict resolution mode. Now, the conflicts that have, that we deal with are conflicts that have set in place a certain status quo, which, as unacceptable as it is, they seem to hold politically. And therefore, often, as international actors, these conflicts, because of their length, because of their seemingly calm status quo, they don't raise any kind of alarm for us. But then these conflicts are primarily political, and unfortunately, water is not very high on the decision-making body's agenda. And so, from my experience, I think that the technocrats are most creative, and this is something that Alyssa also alluded to, in terms of identifying and offering these entry points to political deadlocks or political maneuvering or stalling, by having a proper understanding of the need for a common, dignified quality of life among the constituencies. And obviously, this kind of dignified life is ensured by access to water and sanitation services, as well as water for economic livelihoods. So these 1.5 track technocrats are really instrumental, not only in identifying the actors who could play a reconciling role, but they're also able to offer a different perspective to decision makers, as well as incentives for their engagement, particularly in line with their political I's and P's, their interests and their positions. So I have, gone through the guidebook, and I've looked at this conflict analysis tool with that perspective, in the sense of how could I practically be able to use that analysis within those settings. And usually, engaging in this 1.5 track water for peace diplomacy requires a year-long preparation, and it includes, among others, conducting both technical and political assessments and mapping of actors. And this is where I find the conflict analysis tool that you've developed extremely interesting. Now, on a practical side, I would really be keen to explore a fast-track version of the tool that could be used in that pre-engagement of main national actors phase. I'm also, curious to see if the use of the tool, again, in a fast track version, would have differences in the conflict analysis if I'm running it by first track actors or 1.5 track actors. And I believe that's something that could be worth testing with the tool, because it would really assist significantly in identifying and bridging entry points, both for the development cooperation agencies as well as the external actors, so that we could really ensure that any support we provide would be towards viable political processes, of which water is a key ingredient. And it would be also interesting to see if this fast track version could be used to revisit the analysis that was done prior to the initiation of the process, the project, or the diplomacy effort, somewhere, midway through, and to be able to also see if the analysis that we have conducted, if the dynamics that we have observed have in any way been modified through the process of diplomacy that we have set in place. So I'll stop here and give the floor back to you, Emma.
Great, thank you so much. That was really interesting to hear your reflections also about how the tool could be utilized. And now we have the final sort of opening speech from Japhet. Yes. Yeah. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I am Japhet Siewe Djanni. I'm from Pôle, Dakar in Senegal. I have a background on hydraulic sanitation engineer and climate change across Africa, West Africa, and North Africa. So about the Senegal approach to hydro diplomacy. So I am the assistant coordinator of Pôle Dakar. Pôle Dakar is an initiative established within the Ministry of Hydraulic and Sanitation Senegal. So it aims to promote hydro diplomacy and water cooperation. It's aimed also to contribute to the follow-up of the 9 World Water Forum held in Dakar in 2022. So, to my contribution to this panel, as Senegal, the Senegal River Development Organization, in French we call OMBS, is a perfect example of the practice hydro diplomacy across 4 countries, like Guinea, Senegal, Mauritania, and Mali. So the shared preservation of major international rivers holds untapped potential for building through a renewed form of hydro diplomacy. Best practice highlight the importance of integrating stakeholders into conceptual framework and institutional tools, including basin organization and riparian community. Considering the current challenge faced by local population in Africa, specifically the challenge is climate change, climate change, water quality, like pollution, and they did not take account the culture or the tradition in water policy. So, to considering the current challenge faced by the local community, the sustainable management, the development of new analytical tools could strengthen this cooperative approach, promoting sustainable management and conflict prevention in transboundary water resource management. So, and for example, in the 10-year strategy of Pôle Dakar, we are planning to develop the concept of Afrocentric hydro-diplomacy based on culture and tradition of rural population. So, and we take this account for the new water management policies. And in addition, we are creating a safe space for inclusive dialogue between regional and international stakeholders. So the Pôle Dakar serves as a monitoring platform for conflict management and prevention. Therefore, it helps to consolidate peace and security around shared water resource management. So, in conclusion, as the Pôle Dakar it aims to bring down the barrier between different knowledge or different areas of knowledge. So, as we gather here, let's make water resource a driver of peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Japhet. I think that the relevance of the sort of local knowledge and local understandings of water use, and also through that then water diplomacy, is something that is really important and that we've tried to really tackle in our tool. It's maybe not so visible as we would like to have it yet, but it's a very important part, I think, of the application of the tool, that you sort of understand. I mean, of course, that's the main reason of the tool, as well as to understand the region in which you are operating, but also that you bring in the sort of local voices and knowledge. All right. I thought maybe we can still not quite. I will go to audience questions soon, but I thought in order for also to give you a chance to maybe comment on each other's points of view and so on, I could ask you some more specific questions, perhaps connected to your experience and all that you do in your own work. So maybe I would actually go back to Jenni at this point to ask, actually, because we've heard now different perspectives, very specifically on the tool as such, but then more generally on water diplomacy. And I would maybe ask, because Jenni is a peace mediation expert, so what in your view is, or are there some sort of blind spots maybe in water cooperation that where we could learn from the peace mediation side to sort of get closer towards actual water diplomacy? It was a very complicated way of asking the question. And quite short answers at this point.
Sure. Well, I mean, everybody can learn from peace mediation approaches and everything, I think. But I mean, that's sort of, isn't that the idea of the water diplomacy approach, is that we take technical knowledge together with diplomacy tools and peace mediation. And I think sort of from my experience working with very technical people is that, I mean, there often are obvious technical solutions to many things, but politically they tend to be quite more difficult to then achieve. So a lot of the discussions that I've at least had with technical people is that, well, I mean, the best, most obvious solution might not be the one that we end up reaching here. It's rather than the one that the parties are the actors are most satisfied with. So I think that's sort of one of the obvious sort of principles of our field that applies here really well.
Very true, and maybe also like that. Something that I've discovered, not necessarily coming from the technical water side, that maybe the solutions that seem the most obvious and sort of technically true are not then just possible. Then maybe going back to Alyssa, because we have been, maybe this question was on my mind, especially because we have been trying to update the conflict analysis tool, or not only trying, but we have been updating the conflict analysis tool to further take into account all of these aspects that we have kind of maybe, I feel, neglected when we were first preparing it. And also because we now, when we have been discussing the tool with so many people, we've gathered quite a lot of new insight. So one of these insights, and this is a very obvious one, I thought more of when we were first developing it, is this sort of gendered perspective to water diplomacy. So what do you think, Alyssa, is how can we better integrate these gender aspects into water diplomacy in your view?
I think that's a great question, and I think we see a growing body of work that's really taking on this topic of gender and water diplomacy, looking at how gender is practiced, just even in negotiations and expectations of behavior in terms of representation and barrier to access, but then also in terms of what's considered in, or who is considered in policies and who's affected by policies and potential cooperative agreements. And so I think we've seen that growing, and I think that that's something that can be built into some of the questions of the tool. And we also see on the water diplomacy side also practices like the Women in Water Diplomacy Network. So if you see this pin around at any conference, that would be representation of that network, and it's a great opportunity to really kind of take down some of those barriers. I think while that can be built into the tool a little bit and really asking kind of those different dimensions of gender perspectives, it really depends on who's using the tool, because of course the tool is this big umbrella. So the extent that you really delve into any topic is kind of given on the biases of the person and what they're interested in looking at. So I think that's something that maybe could be highlighted a little bit more as something to be considered. And I think you could also take it a step further, because we have seen progress bringing in the gender perspective on water diplomacy, but really we don't see that much from an intersectional lens. And I think that that's definitely a place this space could grow quite a bit more, both in the literature behind it that's practitioner and academic driven, but then also in how we practice it.
Okay, thank you. This is something that we, like I said, we need to be more mindful of. Then maybe I will jump to Japhet here to ask for your perspective on the sort of potential, because I know that the Pôle Dakar has also been developing all kinds of analytical approaches. So how do you see the potential of developing, or what is the role of these analytical models and tools and approaches to support water diplomacy or hydro diplomacy?
Yes, thank you for the question. For me, I'm in Pôle Dakar. I think, as I said in my the analysis tools, I think you should consider the current challenge, face the current challenge. Like in Africa, you have climate change, we have access to data. Yeah. So you need to collaborate with the different stakeholders. So and I think this can threaten the cooperative approach. Yes, and promoting the sustainability of water management. Yes. In Pôle Dakar, we are developing a quantitative conceptual model for mapping source of conflict, potential source of conflict, and peace and cooperation. So to date, we are developing quantitative and he remained the character chief modest.
Interesting, and that's a very good point. That well, first of all, that you don't want to just develop analytical tools for the sake of it, but you really have to think of what challenge you try to solve with it, or at least to somehow understand better. And then the other thing is that our model is very qualitative in many ways, that we don't really look at the more sort of quantitative. Of course, I understand that your tool is maybe also a bit different, more like foresee the developments that are happening and the risks, and to map them. But maybe there is a need for these different approaches. Is very qualitative and the quantitative approach also to come together and work together.
Yeah, we are open to collaboration and foster these tools.
Great. Then finally, Natasha, I know that you have also been working on simulations and trainings on water diplomacy issues. So how do you see that, especially I guess the role of some sort of simulations as a part of training for water diplomacy experts, and could this sort of conflict analysis approach somehow benefit those sort of trainings?
Thank you, Emma, for the question. Well, I mentioned earlier that when I looked at this, I also, looked at the conflict analysis tool from the perspective of actual negotiations, and interestingly, some of the elements in the tool are actually parts of the actual political analysis that is conducted to identify, the interests and positions of states, but also those of their neighbors. So usually in these mock negotiations, simulations, role-playing, we prepare those I's and P's for the trainees and develop the guidelines for each delegation. So I was thinking that a shorter version of the conflict analysis tool for water diplomacy could actually assist the trainees in a better understanding not only of the dynamics and the actual decision makers, but also the opportunities for compromise, and most importantly, how they could develop, their BATNA, their best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what it could do in these kinds of settings, for the mock negotiations, is that having this kind of analysis also illustrates the complexities and the interdependencies among actors that are both not only water, engineers, but they are also political actors. And in a way, it could assist the trainees in understanding the different skills of a successful negotiator, who really has to understand the people, the process, and the problem in order to be able to reach a win-win positive sum outcome. I do think that it's worth experimenting with the introduction of the conflict analysis tool in such trainings. And I think that it has to be tweaked a little bit to provide probably a more practical version, a shorter version, and I would definitely be willing to experiment that with you through the mock negotiations that I lead.
Sounds really interesting, and definitely I'm also I can see that something like this could work and potentially be useful. Great. Maybe I'll give the chance to the audience now to ask some questions. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Maggie from USAID's water team. Thank you all for the presentations. This is really interesting. I have two questions, one for Japhet and then one mostly for Emma, because probably for everyone. Japhet, I'm curious about Pôle Dakar. Are you mainly working at the transboundary level with other countries, or is there also work or intended work on communities that might have competing needs within Senegal, along the Senegal River? Just curious if you also work at community level. And then the one that's mostly for Emma, but maybe for everyone, you were talking about the use of this tool in monitoring in addition to just at the beginning of a project. And as you're mentioning, it's quite a qualitative tool, and that can be difficult and time intensive to combine that information. I'm curious if you all have suggestions about